quiet neighborhood, a group of kids just having fun. But when one neighbor makes a single phone call, everything changes. The cops show up, but that's not where the story ends. What happens next will make you question everything about fairness, judgment, and how fast karma can strike. You won't believe the twist that comes 5 minutes later. Keep watching, because what happens next is nothing like you expect. Before we start, let me know where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any future videos. It was a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon in the small suburban neighborhood where everything seemed peaceful. The sound of children laughing and the bounce of a basketball echoed through the streets, mixing with the soft hum of lawnmowers and the occasional car driving by. A group of kids, mostly around 10 to 12 years old, were enjoying the day, playing a friendly game of basketball on a court they'd claimed as their own. It wasn't anything special, just a couple of friends shooting hoops, joking around, and running up and down the court. They were the kind of kids who loved being outside, enjoying the simple things, and didn't have a care in the world. But across the street, in a house that had seen better days, something was brewing. Mr. Thompson, a man in his 50s who'd lived in the neighborhood for years, had been watching the kids from his front porch. His house, a little run down with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn, seemed to blend into the background of the quiet street. No one really paid much attention to him. He wasn't the type to socialize or get involved with anyone in the neighborhood. But on this particular afternoon, something about the kids bothered him. Maybe it was the noise. Maybe it was the fact that they didn't look like they belonged in the neighborhood. Or maybe it was just the way they were laughing and having fun without a care in the world, while he sat there, alone, on his porch. Whatever the reason, he didn't like it. The laughter, the sound of the ball bouncing on the asphalt, the way the kids seemed so carefree, it all rubbed him the wrong way. And so without a second thought, Mr. Thompson did something that would change everything. He picked up his phone and dialed the police. He told them there were suspicious kids causing a disturbance in the neighborhood. He didn't really know who they were. He didn't even care. All he wanted was for them to leave, to stop making noise and disturbing the quiet, peaceful street he'd come to think of as his own. He made his call, hung up, and went back inside his house, thinking the problem would be taken care of quickly. He had no idea that his decision was about to set off a chain of events that would completely turn everything around. The police didn't take long to arrive. Within minutes, the unmistakable sound of sirens could be heard approaching the block. The kids, still busy with their game, didn't hear them at first. They were caught up in their own world, making jokes, trying to sink shots, and just enjoying their Saturday. But as the sirens grew louder and louder, they started to look around, confused. A police car turned the corner, followed by another one. The flashing lights lit up the street, casting an eerie glow against the walls of nearby houses. The officers stepped out of their cars, their expressions unreadable, and walked toward the group of kids. The air immediately felt tense. The kids froze, unsure of what was happening or why the police were there. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were just playing basketball, having fun. The officers started asking questions. What are you kids doing here? Do you live around here? Do you have permission to use this court? The kids, now nervous and unsure of how to respond, gave their names and explained they were just out playing with no intention of causing any trouble. The questions came fast and sharp. One officer pulled out a notebook and started jotting down notes, while the other kept looking around, almost like they were expecting to find something wrong. The tension was building. None of the kids had ever been in a situation like this before. They looked at each other, wide-eyed, hoping this was some kind of misunderstanding. But the officers weren't backing down. They continued their questioning, looking at the kids as if they were suspects. It felt wrong to them, but they had no choice but to stand there and answer, all the while wondering why they were being treated like this in the first place. It wasn't long before another car pulled up. It wasn't a police car. It was a black sedan, and out stepped a woman dressed in a professional outfit. She walked up the driveway of Mr. Thompson's house, her high heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her eyes scanned the street quickly before locking onto the scene unfolding by the basketball court. She had a stern look on her face, and that's when Mr. Thompson noticed her too. His face turned pale as he saw her approach. He knew who she was. It was his daughter, Linda, the one person he had been trying to avoid for the past few months. Linda was a social worker, someone who fought for the rights of children and worked to make sure things like this didn't happen. She had been trying to reach out to her father, but he had ignored her calls. Now, there she was, standing on the same street, about to witness something that would shake him to his core. Linda's eyes locked with Mr. Thompson's for a brief moment. Without saying a word, she turned toward the kids, her face softening with a look of concern. She had no idea what was going on, but she knew something wasn't right. She had been busy all morning with her work, but now, in front of her father's house, she could see what had just transpired. And she wasn't happy about it. Linda didn't waste any time. She walked straight toward her father, her heels clicking sharply with each step. Her expression was hard to read, but the anger in her eyes was clear. Mr. Thompson, still standing on his porch, suddenly felt a tight knot form in his stomach. He could already sense that something was wrong. Linda stopped in front of him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice cold, barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson tried to speak, but Linda cut him off before he could even get a word out. "I don't know what your problem is with those kids, but I'm about to find out," she snapped. The words hit Mr. Thompson like a slap in the face. He was speechless, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to say. But he knew he couldn't lie to her, especially not after what he'd just done. He had been hoping she wouldn't find out, hoping this would all blow over. But now, here she was, standing in front of him, and the weight of what he had done hit him all at once. He didn't know how to explain himself. The kids had annoyed him, sure, but that was no excuse for what he'd done. He never thought calling the police would lead to this. Linda's face was a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You called the cops on them? On kids who were just playing basketball?" she asked, her voice rising now, drawing the attention of the officers who were still standing by the group of kids, unsure of how to handle the situation. "Do you even realize what that could have done to them? What if they'd been treated differently? What if something worse had happened?" Mr. Thompson opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He was caught. His own daughter, the one person who could see through him, was confronting him about his actions. The reality of it all hit him harder than anything he'd felt in a long time. He had spent so many years trying to bury the person he was, trying to ignore the mistakes he'd made, but now they were staring him in the face, and there was no running away from it. Linda didn't wait for an answer. Instead, she turned to face the officers who had been questioning the kids. She walked over to them, speaking quickly and firmly. "These kids are innocent," she told them. "They were doing nothing wrong. You don't need to be here. This was a mistake." Her tone was unwavering, and the officers looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable, before one of them slowly nodded. As the situation started to settle, Mr. Thompson stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The events were spiraling out of his control, and he could feel the walls closing in. He had no idea what his daughter would do next, but he knew he had just made a mistake he couldn't undo. The worst part was, he knew he deserved whatever was coming his way. Linda's words hit harder than anything Mr. Thompson had expected. As she spoke to the officers, his heart sank deeper with each passing second. His world felt like it was crumbling around him. He had hoped for so long that he could keep the truth hidden, that he could continue living his life without facing the consequences of his actions. But now, his own daughter was standing up for those kids, and the shame was unbearable. The officers, realizing they were standing on shaky ground, began to back off. They nodded at Linda, mumbling apologies as they turned to leave. The kids, still standing on the court, were visibly confused but relieved. They had no idea what had just happened or why the officers were leaving, but they were grateful the situation seemed to be calming down. As the officers drove away, Linda turned back toward her father, her eyes narrowing. She had one last thing to say before she was done with him. "You've got to understand something, Dad," she said, her voice now tinged with frustration and hurt. "What you just did wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice. You saw a group of kids, and for some reason, you thought the worst of them. And then you did something that could have ruined their lives." She took a deep breath, trying to hold back her emotions. "You don't get to play the victim here, and you don't get to ignore this." Mr. Thompson felt the weight of her words settle over him, his throat tightening as guilt flooded his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Linda had always been the strong one, the one who fought for what was right, who stood up for others. And now, here she was, standing before him, holding him accountable for his actions. He couldn't argue with her. There was no excuse for what he had done. He was wrong, and deep down, he knew it. Linda took one last look at him before turning to walk toward the kids. As she got closer, she knelt down to their level, offering them a reassuring smile. "You guys are okay. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not," she said gently. The kids nodded, still processing what had just happened. Some of them looked relieved, while others seemed more puzzled than ever, trying to figure out why they'd been treated like criminals in the first place. Linda's voice softened as she continued. "Enjoy your game, and don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong here." She stood up and turned back to face her father, her expression hardening once more. "I'm done here," she said quietly. "But you and I are going to have a long talk when I get back to the office." With that, Linda walked away, leaving Mr. Thompson standing on his porch, frozen in place, feeling the full weight of his daughter's disappointment hanging over him. The silence that followed Linda's departure was deafening. Mr. Thompson stood there, staring at the empty street, unable to move, unable to speak. He could still hear the distant sound of the basketball bouncing on the court, a stark contrast to the tension that gripped him. His hands were trembling, and he felt a tightness in his chest, as though the weight of everything he had done was slowly suffocating him. He had hoped, for just a moment, that the situation would pass, that Linda would leave and forget about the confrontation. But deep down, he knew that wasn't going to happen. The worst part was that he had no one to blame but himself. The kids, innocent and full of life, had done nothing wrong. They were just trying to enjoy a simple game, something every child should be able to do without fear. But because of his own biases, his own assumptions, they had been dragged into a situation they never should have been part of. And Linda, his daughter, the one person who would never let him get away with such ignorance, had seen right through him. Mr. Thompson slowly sank into a chair on his porch, staring at the ground. He tried to replay the events in his mind, but it all felt blurry now. The anger he had felt earlier, the impulse to call the police, it all seemed so trivial in hindsight. What had he been thinking? The more he thought about it, the worse he felt. He had been so quick to judge, so willing to take drastic action over something so small. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, keeping everyone at arm's length. And now those walls were coming down, one brick at a time. Meanwhile, across the street, the kids had gone back to their game. But the mood had shifted. There was a quietness in the air now, a tension that hadn't been there before. They were all still processing what had happened. Some of them whispered to each other, trying to make sense of it, while others kept shooting hoops, too nervous to speak. The question that hung over them wasn't about the game anymore. It was about the fact that they had been treated like criminals for no reason at all. None of them had ever been in a situation like this. They had no idea why the police had shown up, or why they had been questioned like that. But what they did know was that something wasn't right. They were just kids, and all they wanted to do was play. And for a brief moment, as they glanced over at Mr. Thompson's house, they couldn't help but wonder, what had they done to deserve this? As Mr. Thompson sat on his porch, the reality of his actions began to sink in, heavier with each passing second. He couldn't shake the image of Linda's face when she confronted him. He had seen that look before, many times. It was the look of someone who knew the truth, someone who wasn't afraid to speak it, and now it was aimed squarely at him. He had no idea how he was going to fix this, But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just pretend it never happened. As the hours passed, Mr. Thompson stayed on his porch, lost in thought, barely moving. The sound of the basketball game continued to echo from across the street, but it seemed distant now, almost like it belonged to another world. His mind was racing, trying to piece together everything that had happened, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like his world was unraveling. He had always prided himself on being a quiet, law-abiding citizen. He kept to himself, never involved in neighborhood drama or conflict. But today, everything had changed. He had crossed a line, one that he could never uncross. It wasn't just about calling the police on a group of kids. It was about what he had believed in that moment. He had judged them, assumed the worst about them, simply because they didn't look like the kind of people he thought belonged in his neighborhood. That was the ugly truth that he was now confronting, and as much as he hated to admit it, he couldn't deny it any longer. Linda's words kept echoing in his head. What you did wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. She was right. He had chosen to make a call that would have far-reaching consequences. He had chosen to judge people based on the color of their skin, based on his own narrow view of the world. And now, he was left to face the fallout of that decision. The thought of how easily it could have gone wrong made him sick to his stomach. What if the kids had been treated differently? What if the situation had escalated, like so many others had in the past? What if something worse had happened? He couldn't shake the image of the police officers approaching the kids, questioning them like criminals. For a moment, he had wanted to look away, pretend it wasn't happening, but he hadn't been able to. He had made that call. He had put them in that situation. Across the street, the kids had finished their game and were starting to head home. They walked slowly, talking amongst themselves, trying to shake off the tension of the afternoon. They weren't angry, not really. They didn't fully understand what had just transpired, but they could feel the weight of it. They had been treated like outsiders, like they didn't belong in the very place they had grown up. It wasn't right, and they knew it. But there was nothing they could do about it. Not yet, anyway. As the last of the kids disappeared down the street, Mr. Thompson finally stood up from his porch. His legs were stiff and his body felt heavy, like he had been carrying a weight he hadn't known was there. He walked slowly toward the driveway, glancing over at the empty court. The basketball hoop was still there, still standing tall. But now it felt like a symbol of something he couldn't ignore anymore. He turned back toward his house, eyes drawn to the window where Linda had left. The conversation they would have later was inevitable. She would demand answers, and he knew he wouldn't be able to hide behind his excuses anymore. He couldn't pretend he was just a bystander in this mess. He had been a part of it, and it was time to face the truth. As he walked back inside, Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, knowing that the hardest part was still to come. The shame he felt now was just the beginning. What would Linda say to him when she came back? What would the neighbors think when they found out the truth? And most of all, what would those kids think when they heard the real story? The weight of it all was crushing, but there was no running away from it. He had to face it, whatever came next. The evening crept in slowly, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. Mr. Thompson sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He tried to distract himself, flipping through the newspaper, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the events of the day. He could still see the kids' faces, confused and scared, and he could hear Linda's voice, sharp and disappointed, cutting through the air like a blade. He felt as though everything he had built his life around, his comfort, his solitude, his sense of control, was slipping through his fingers. He heard a car pull up in the driveway. Linda was back. She had said she would be, and she didn't keep promises lightly. As soon as the door opened, Mr. Thompson felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from the hours of sitting in the same spot, thinking about everything he had done wrong. When Linda walked into the kitchen, her face was calm, but there was an intensity in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. "Dad," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that made his heart race. We need to talk." She didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, she took a seat across from him at the table, her gaze never leaving his. The silence between them felt heavy, more uncomfortable than any conversation they had ever had before. Mr. Thompson opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He was trying to find an explanation, some way to make what he had done seem less unforgivable, but he knew deep down that no explanation could fix what had happened. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. Linda took a deep breath, then spoke, her voice firm but tinged with hurt. "You don't get it, do you?" she asked. "What you did today, it wasn't just a bad call. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. You put those kids in danger, Dad. You treated them like criminals for no reason. And worse." She paused, her voice shaking now just a little. "You hurt me. You hurt me in a way I never thought you would. You've spent your whole life teaching me that we stand up for what's right, that we don't judge people based on their appearance or where they come from. And today you did the exact opposite." Mr. Thompson's chest tightened as he listened to his daughter's words. He wanted to say something, to explain himself, but the guilt was overwhelming. He had never seen Linda so angry, so disappointed. She was the one person in the world who had always looked up to him, who had always believed in him. And now, in this moment, he felt like he had failed her more than he had ever failed anyone. "I'm sorry, Linda," he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. I don't know what came over me. I was angry. I was frustrated, and I didn't think. I didn't stop to think about what I was doing." His words sounded weak even to him. They felt hollow, like he was trying to make excuses instead of facing the reality of what he had done. Linda's eyes softened, just a little, but she didn't let him off the hook. "I know you're sorry, but sorry isn't enough this time, Dad. You need to understand why this was so wrong. It's not just about a phone call to the police. It's about the message it sends. It's about the fact that you saw those kids as a threat, just because of the way they looked, just because of where they were. That's what needs to change." Mr. Thompson sat there silently, taking in everything she said. He had always prided himself on being a reasonable man, someone who took the time to think things through. But in that moment, he realized how quickly his assumptions had clouded his judgment. The kids had done nothing wrong. They hadn't asked for trouble. They hadn't deserved to be treated like that. And yet he had allowed his own biases and frustration to shape his actions. Linda leaned back in her chair, her eyes searching his face as if waiting for him to truly get it. "I want you to understand what you've done, not just to those kids, but to me too. I don't want to just hear words, Dad. I want to see change. I need to know that you're willing to face the truth. Not just about them, but about yourself." The weight of her words landed on him with crushing force. He had always been the kind of man who tried to avoid confrontation, who hid behind his pride and his sense of security. But now that wall was gone, and he was left exposed. All he could do was sit there staring at the table, knowing that he had to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how painful they might be. Linda stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. She didn't say anything more, but the look on her face was clear. She was done talking for now. She had said what needed to be said. And as she walked out of the room, Mr. Thompson sat there, alone once again, feeling the full weight of what he had done. He had lost something today, something important, and no amount of apologies or excuses would ever bring it back. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Mr. Thompson couldn't bring himself to do much of anything. He barely touched his dinner, his mind still spinning from the conversation with Linda. Every time he tried to focus on something, anything, his thoughts would circle back to those kids. The way they had looked at the officers, confused and scared. The way they must have felt when he made that call. And the way Linda had looked at him, disappointed and hurt. It all felt like a weight he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. He sat on his porch later that night, the sky above him darkening as the evening slipped into night. The quiet of the neighborhood seemed almost suffocating now. He used to find comfort in this silence, in the predictable stillness of suburban life. But tonight it felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. He thought about how things had been before, how he had built his life on a foundation of being respectable and proper, how he had kept his distance from anything or anyone that threatened his sense of control. But now, that image of himself was shattered, and for the first time, he saw just how hollow that facade had been. What kind of man had he become, really? He had spent years hiding behind his bitterness, behind his assumptions about others. It had been easier that way, easier to blame the world for his problems than to face the uncomfortable truths about himself. But now, everything felt different. He could no longer ignore what he had done. He couldn't run from it. He had been forced to confront his own prejudice, his own mistakes, and it was worse than he had ever imagined. As the night grew darker, Mr. Thompson heard the faint sound of footsteps coming down the street. A group of kids, laughing, walking home after a long day. They were the same kids he had called the police on just hours earlier. They walked past his house, unaware of the man sitting on the porch who had made their afternoons so much harder. They were still laughing, still joking around like nothing had happened. It was almost as if the entire situation had been erased from their minds. But for Mr. Thompson, it wasn't that easy. He couldn't just let it go. He had to make things right somehow. The problem was, he had no idea how. How do you fix something like this? How do you make amends for the harm you've caused, especially when that harm has touched people you barely know? He could apologize to the kids, but what good would that do? The damage had already been done. He had already judged them without even knowing them. He had already treated them as less than human, simply because of their appearance. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Linda's car pulling into the driveway. She had come back, but this time, it was different. There was no anger in her eyes, no disappointment. She was calm, perhaps too calm. When she walked up to the porch, she didn't speak right away. She just stood there for a moment watching him. Mr. Thompson looked up at her, unsure of what to expect. "Dad," she said, her voice softer now, but still serious. "I need you to understand something. You don't fix this with words. You don't just apologize and expect everything to be okay. What you did today wasn't just a mistake. It's a reflection of how deep these issues go. But you can make a choice. You can choose to change. You can choose to learn. And that's the only way this will ever get better." Her words stung, but they were true. He had been living his life a certain way for so long, stuck in his own narrow view of the world. It had been easy to blame others, to see the world in black and white. But now the world felt much more complicated, and he realized he had been blind to it for far too long. He didn't know how to change. He didn't know where to start. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had to try. Linda looked at him one last time, then turned to walk inside. But before she disappeared into the house, she stopped and said, "I'm not going to give up on you, Dad. But you have to do the work. You have to do better." And with that, she was gone. Mr. Thompson sat there in the darkness, the weight of her words settling over him. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know if he ever would. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep going the way he had been. Something had to change. And for the first time, he realized that change had to start with him. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty and reflection. Mr. Thompson went through the motions of his daily routine, but everything felt different now. The quiet of the neighborhood no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a reminder of his failures. Every time he saw a group of kids laughing on the street, or heard the sound of a basketball bouncing, his mind would flash back to that afternoon, back to the moment he called the police. He couldn't escape it. No matter how hard he tried to move on, it kept pulling him back. And in the silence of his own home, the weight of what he had done seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Linda had gone back to her work, and though she was calm with him, it was clear that things had changed between them. There was a distance now, a gap that hadn't been there before. She was still willing to talk to him, still trying to guide him, but he knew she wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. She wasn't angry anymore, but the hurt was still there, lingering in her words and her eyes. Mr. Thompson realized that the trust he had taken for granted had been shaken, and it wasn't something he could fix overnight. He had thought at first that maybe time would heal things. Maybe if he just laid low and kept his head down, it would all blow over. But he quickly realized that wasn't going to work. The damage he had caused wasn't something that could be erased with silence. He needed to do something. Something that would show he was serious about changing, about making amends. But what? How could he possibly make up for the harm he had caused? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just about fixing things with Linda or the kids. It was about fixing something deeper inside himself. He had spent so many years avoiding uncomfortable truths, ignoring his own biases, that he had never truly looked at the world around him. He had never questioned the assumptions he had been carrying, the way he had viewed people based on superficial things like race, class, and appearance. It was easier to judge from a distance than to face the reality of the world. But now he couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, a week after the incident, Mr. Thompson made a decision. He was going to start by confronting his own ignorance. It wouldn't be easy, but he had to try. He had to face the people he had wronged, starting with the kids. The next morning, he walked across the street to the basketball court. It felt awkward, as though he were stepping into a world he had no business being in. But he kept walking, determined. When he reached the court, the kids were there again, playing just like before. Their laughter filled the air, but there was an edge to it now, something different. They saw him approaching, and for a moment they all stopped, their eyes wary. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath. This was it. He had no idea how they would react, but he had to try. He had to own up to what he had done. "Hey," he called out, his voice a little shaky but steady enough. "Can I talk to you all for a minute?" The kids exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of him. He was the man who had called the cops on them just days earlier. He was the one who had treated them like criminals for no reason. But they stayed quiet, watching him closely. "I'm really sorry for what happened the other day," Mr. Thompson began, feeling the weight of every word. "I made a mistake. I judged you all unfairly. I called the police on you, and that was wrong. I want to apologize for putting you in that situation. You didn't deserve it, and I'm sorry for making you feel like you didn't belong here." The kids were silent for a moment, processing his words. Mr. Thompson wasn't sure if they believed him, or if they even wanted to hear it, but he kept going, speaking from the heart. "I know I can't take back what I did, and I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. But I want to do better. I want to change, and I want to show you that I can. I don't expect anything from you, but I hope you know I'm truly sorry." The kids stood there, still unsure of what to make of this apology. But then one of them, a boy no older than 11, stepped forward. He had a serious look on his face, but there was something in his eyes that softened as he spoke. "We don't really know why you did what you did," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "But we're glad you said sorry. It was really messed up what happened, but thanks for saying it." He hesitated, then added, "It means something." Mr. Thompson nodded, his heart heavy with the understanding that this was just the beginning. The road to redemption wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be quick. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. As he turned to walk back to his house, he didn't feel the weight of shame pressing on him as much as before. It was still there, of course, but now there was also a glimmer of hope that somehow he could make things right, one step at a time. As Mr. Thompson walked back to his house, the weight in his chest had lessened, but it hadn't disappeared. The apology to the kids, though small, had been a step forward, but he knew it wasn't enough. It couldn't be. He had to prove to them, and to himself, that he was committed to change. The kids had accepted his apology, but there was still a lingering distrust in their eyes. They didn't know him, not really, and they had every right to be skeptical. One apology didn't erase what had happened. Back in his living room, Mr. Thompson sat down in front of the television, but he wasn't watching it. His mind was racing. He thought about the kids again, their faces, their expressions. He thought about Linda and how she had looked at him the other night, disappointed but still hopeful. He had a long road ahead of him and he knew it. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could start making changes, starting with himself. The next morning he found himself at the local library. It felt like an odd thing for him to do. He wasn't much of a reader, and he hadn't stepped into the library in years, but it felt like the right place to start. He needed to learn. He needed to understand more about the world beyond his narrow perspective, and if he wanted to prove to Linda, to the kids, and to himself that he was capable of change, it had to start with education. He spent hours there, reading books on race, bias, and social justice. He picked up articles about systemic inequality, about the experiences of people who didn't look like him, about the ways society had created divides that weren't always visible on the surface. He felt uncomfortable at first, reading about things he had never really thought about. It was easier to remain ignorant, to live in a world where everything made sense to him. But the more he read, the more he began to see the cracks in his own thinking. The more he understood how his own prejudices had shaped the way he saw others and the way he had treated them. By the end of the week, Mr. Thompson had read several books and attended a community discussion about racial equality. It was uncomfortable for him to be in a room full of people who were so open about their struggles, about the injustices they had faced. But he stayed. He listened. And for the first time, he felt a real sense of guilt for his own ignorance. It wasn't enough to just apologize. He had to take action. He had to do the work. Linda noticed the change in him. It wasn't immediate, but over time she saw him making a genuine effort to understand. He started talking about the books he had read, about the things he was learning. She could tell he wasn't just going through the motions either. He had changed. He wasn't the same man who had called the police on those kids. One evening, as they were sitting together at the kitchen table, Linda spoke up. "You've been doing the work, haven't you?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. Mr. Thompson nodded, a little sheepishly. "Yeah, I have. It's not easy, but I want to understand. I want to do better. I need to." Linda didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, watching him for a long moment. Then she smiled. A small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I can see that. It's not easy. But you're doing it. And that's what matters." The conversation was a turning point for Mr. Thompson. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of his efforts. It was a sign that Linda could begin to trust him again, that she believed he was trying to make real change. But more than that, it was a reminder that change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, and it takes time. That night, as he sat alone in his living room, Mr. Thompson thought about everything he had learned in the past week. He thought about the kids, about how they had reacted to his apology, how they hadn't held it against him, but had still left a piece of doubt in his mind. They had no reason to trust him yet, but he was determined to prove to them that he was serious. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could influence the future. And he was ready to do whatever it took to rebuild the trust he had broken. There was still a long way to go. But for the first time, Mr. Thompson felt like he was on the right path. And that was enough to keep him moving forward. Weeks passed, and Mr. Thompson continued his quiet journey of self-reflection and change. He wasn't the type to broadcast his efforts, but every day he made small decisions that reinforced his commitment to being a better person. Someone who didn't just talk about equality, but practiced it. He spent more time in the community, attending local events, speaking with his neighbors, and getting to know people he had once ignored. He volunteered at a local youth center, offering to help with their after-school programs, doing his part to ensure that kids from all backgrounds felt welcomed and supported. It wasn't easy. There were moments when old habits crept in, when he felt frustrated with the pace of change, when he wanted to retreat back into his comfort zone. But he didn't. He pushed through, reminded by the faces of those kids, by the look in Linda's eyes when she saw him trying. And with each new step he felt a little lighter, as if the burden of guilt was slowly being replaced with something else, something more hopeful. One afternoon, as Mr. Thompson walked home from a community meeting, he saw the kids again. They were playing basketball on the same court, just as they had been that day weeks ago when everything had started. They were laughing and shouting, their energy filling the air. It struck him how little had changed for them. They were still out there, doing what kids do best, playing, enjoying life, not weighed down by the things that had weighed him down. He stopped at the edge of the court and watched them for a moment. He wasn't sure if he was ready to approach them again, not yet anyway, but he knew he couldn't stay on the sidelines forever. A few of the kids noticed him standing there, and for a second they stopped. There was a brief pause, a moment of hesitation, and then one of the boys, one of the kids who had spoken up when he'd apologized, motioned for him to come over. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," the boy called out, his voice friendly but cautious. "You gonna join us for a game or what?" Mr. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected them to call him over, hadn't expected them to remember him. But here they were, extending a small gesture of kindness, offering him a place in their world, despite everything that had happened. He took a deep breath and walked toward them. As he stepped onto the court, one of the kids tossed him the ball. He caught it, feeling the smooth surface in his hands, a simple reminder of how far he had come since that fateful day. The kids gathered around, joking about who would win, about how bad they were at making layups, about how Mr. Thompson probably couldn't keep up. It was all in good fun, and for the first time, Mr. Thompson felt like he truly belonged. Not because he had apologized or because he had done the right thing, but because he was being accepted, being included by the very people he had once wronged. They played for a while, laughing together. Mr. Thompson wasn't the best on the court. He wasn't even close, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was there. He was part of something now, not just an observer on the sidelines. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, one of the kids, another boy who had been quiet the whole time, looked up at him and said, "You know, you're all right, Mr. Thompson. You might not be the best at basketball, but you're cool." The words, simple as they were, meant more than anything Mr. Thompson had expected. They were a sign that he was starting to repair the damage he had caused. He smiled, a real smile this time, and nodded. "Thanks, kid. I'm just trying to keep up with you all." As the game wound down and the sun began to set, the kids grabbed their things and started to head home. Mr. Thompson stayed behind for a moment, watching them go. For the first time, he didn't feel the guilt or shame that had followed him for so long. He had made mistakes, big ones. But in that moment, he realized that it wasn't about erasing those mistakes. It was about making things right, one step at a time. Linda had been right all along. Change didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always easy. But it was possible, and more importantly, it was worth it. As he walked back to his house, Mr. Thompson knew that this wasn't the end of his journey. It was just another step. There would be more work to do, more moments of discomfort, more times when he would have to challenge his own thinking. But for the first time, he felt ready. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was the only path worth taking. And as he walked, he felt a quiet sense of hope for the future, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was finally becoming the man he had always hoped he could be. The weeks continued to unfold, and with each passing day, Mr. Thompson found himself more immersed in the community than he had ever been before. He was no longer just a distant neighbor, someone who kept to himself and barely interacted with others. He had become a fixture in the local youth center, volunteering his time to help out with the kids, whether it was coaching basketball, setting up activities, or simply offering a listening ear when they needed someone to talk to. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful, and every day he could see the difference it was making, not just in the kids' lives, but in his own as well. One evening, as he was helping clean up after a basketball game at the center, Linda stopped by to visit. She hadn't been to the youth center much herself, but tonight, she came to check in on how things were going. She watched quietly as Mr. Thompson interacted with the kids, giving high fives, encouraging them to keep practicing, and even laughing at a few of their jokes. There was no tension between them now, no awkwardness, just a sense of mutual respect that had grown over time. After the game, Linda waited for him by the entrance. He hadn't noticed her at first, but when he saw her standing there, he wiped his hands on his pants and walked over. "You're looking different," she said with a small smile, her voice teasing but also kind. "I almost didn't recognize you." Mr. Thompson smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Yeah, I've been doing a lot of work lately," he said, his tone modest but proud. "More than I expected, honestly. But it feels good. It feels right." Linda nodded, watching him carefully. She had seen the transformation in him over the past few months, the way he'd started engaging more with the people around him, how he no longer shied away from difficult conversations, how he was actively trying to undo the damage he'd caused. She had watched him grow, not just as a father but as a man. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of discomfort, but the change was undeniable. "You're doing good, Dad," she said quietly. "Really good. I know it wasn't easy for you, but I'm proud of you." Mr. Thompson's chest tightened at her words, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a lump rise in his throat. He had never been one to accept compliments easily, but hearing Linda say that, seeing the pride in her eyes, meant more than anything else he had done so far. It wasn't about his efforts being perfect. It was about the fact that he had made the effort in the first place. That, in itself, was enough to show her, and to show himself, that he was capable of real change. He cleared his throat, trying to hold back the wave of emotion. "Thanks, Linda," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." For a moment they just stood there, the noise of the kids in the background fading into the distance as they shared a quiet, meaningful moment. It was a moment of understanding, a moment of healing. He still had work to do, he knew that, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he was doing it alone. The next day, after a long shift at the youth center, Mr. Thompson decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. It had become one of his favorite activities, a way to clear his head and think. As he walked past familiar houses, he noticed how much the neighborhood had changed for him, not just in the way he interacted with people, but in how he saw them. Before, he had always been so quick to judge, so eager to keep a safe distance from others, thinking that if he kept his head down, everything would be fine. But now he saw people for who they really were, not just neighbors but individuals with stories, struggles, and dreams, just like him. He passed by the basketball court where the kids often played, and for a brief moment, he stopped. He watched them again, the same group of kids he had apologized to weeks ago. They were playing a pickup game, laughing and shouting as they always did. But now, he saw something else in their actions, something that hadn't been there before. They weren't just playing a game. They were showing each other respect, helping one another improve, lifting each other up. And in that moment, Mr. Thompson realized something important. The kids weren't just teaching him how to be better. They were showing him the way to true community. It wasn't about grand gestures or big speeches. It was about showing up. It was about being present, listening, and learning. It was about understanding that everyone, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like, deserved to be treated with dignity. He had learned that lesson from them, and from his daughter, and from the countless hours he had spent trying to change his own heart. He had learned that change wasn't just something you talk about. It was something you lived, every single day. As he turned to continue his walk, Mr. Thompson felt something shift inside of him again. It was the quiet realization that he wasn't just doing this for the kids or Linda. He was doing it for himself, too. He had spent so much of his life carrying around judgments and fears. But now, he was learning how to let go of those burdens. He didn't know where the road ahead would take him, but for the first time, he felt hopeful. The past might have been full of mistakes, but the future was wide open. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it head on. As the weeks turned into months, Mr. Thompson found himself more deeply entrenched in his community. He continued volunteering at the youth center, offering not just his time, but his heart. And it became clear to everyone around him that he wasn't the same person who had made that fateful call to the police all those months ago. He had grown, not just in his actions, but in the way he saw the world and the people around him. His efforts to make amends weren't just a way to ease his own guilt. They had become a true desire to contribute, to rebuild trust, and to be part of something bigger than himself. Linda, who had watched him closely through this process, was starting to see the changes in a way she hadn't expected. At first, she had been cautious, unsure if her father's transformation was just a phase. But the more she saw him interact with others, especially the kids at the center, the more she realized that this was real. Her father wasn't just going through the motions, he was living out the lessons he had learned the hard way. One afternoon, Linda and Mr. Thompson were sitting at the kitchen table sharing a quiet meal together. The conversation was easy, filled with the kind of light-hearted chatter that had been missing from their relationship for so long. There were still moments of awkwardness, of course, but they had become less frequent. They were learning how to communicate again, how to rebuild their connection on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. "You know, Dad," Linda said, looking up from her plate, "I'm really proud of you. I mean, I've seen the work you've been doing, and it's clear that you're committed to changing. But the thing that impresses me the most is that you're actually doing the hard work. You're not just talking about it, you're living it." Mr. Thompson looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "Thanks, Linda. That means a lot coming from you. I won't lie, it's been hard, but I'm learning. Every day, I'm learning." Linda smiled softly, her expression more understanding than it had been in years. "You know, I didn't think I'd ever hear myself say this, but I think you're becoming the man you always said you wanted to be. And that's a big deal." The words hit him harder than he had expected. It wasn't just a casual compliment. It was the acknowledgement of the person he had been, the person he had been trying to change, and the person he was becoming. There had been times when he had doubted himself, when he had wondered if he was capable of real change, of being better. But in that moment, with Linda's words hanging in the air, he realized that maybe he had done it. Maybe, just maybe, he was on the right path. They finished their meal in a comfortable silence, and when they were done, Linda stood up and grabbed her keys. "I've got to run some errands," she said, but before she left, she paused by the door. "I'll see you later, Dad. Keep doing the good work." Mr. Thompson nodded, his heart full as he watched her leave. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of guilt hanging over him. There was still a long way to go, and he knew that. But in that moment, he understood something profound. Change wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. And every step he took, no matter how small, was leading him in the right direction. The following month, a neighborhood event was organized to raise awareness about local youth programs. It was a gathering meant to bring people together, to encourage community involvement and support. Mr. Thompson, as usual, volunteered his time, helping set up, organizing activities, and welcoming people who came to learn more about the programs available to kids in the area. He wasn't a natural at this kind of thing. He wasn't the type to be the center of attention, but he had learned to embrace the importance of community and connection. As the event kicked off, Mr. Thompson noticed a few familiar faces in the crowd. Neighbors he had known for years, people he had never really spoken to, were showing up, some with their kids, some on their own, all here to support a cause he now cared deeply about. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like part of the fabric of the neighborhood, like someone who belonged. He spent the day talking to people, listening to their stories, and answering questions about the youth programs he was involved with. But it wasn't until later that afternoon, when he found himself standing by the basketball court, that he realized just how far he had come. A group of kids, the same ones he had apologized to months earlier, were playing another game of basketball. They had seen him standing off to the side and, after a few moments of hesitation, one of them waved him over. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," the boy called. "You want to play?" Mr. Thompson hesitated for a second. He wasn't exactly a basketball expert, and he wasn't sure how he would fit into the game. But the invitation meant something. It wasn't just a casual gesture. It was their way of saying that they accepted him, that they saw him as part of their community now. He couldn't turn that down. With a smile, he walked over to the court and joined in. The kids were competitive, but they were also patient with him, laughing when he missed a shot or fumbled the ball. It was all in good fun, and for a few minutes, Mr. Thompson forgot about the weight of the past and just enjoyed the game. He wasn't the best player, far from it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was there, and the kids were happy to have him. As the game ended and the kids began to head home, one of the older boys, the same one who had first accepted his apology, came over and gave him a nod of respect. "You did good, Mr. Thompson. You might not be the best, but you played. That counts." Mr. Thompson smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thanks, kid. You're right, it counts." And for the first time, he realized just how much it did count. Not just on the basketball court, but in every aspect of his life. He had started out as a man who made a mistake, but he was becoming someone who was making things right, one step at a time. As he watched the kids walk off into the evening, Mr. Thompson felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and he knew he still had plenty of work to do. But he was no longer defined by his mistakes. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly hopeful about the future. The following week saw Mr. Thompson fully immersed in his new life. The days seemed to pass with a purpose he had never known before. Every morning, he woke up with a sense of responsibility, not just to himself, but to the community that had accepted him, to the kids who trusted him, and to Linda, who had pushed him to be better. The journey he had embarked on, though difficult and sometimes uncomfortable, was slowly beginning to feel like a new chapter, one that was still in the making, but filled with possibility. His work at the youth center continued, and he spent his evenings attending community meetings, learning about ways to further support underprivileged youth and get involved in local activism. He even began to teach a weekly workshop on conflict resolution for kids, using his own experiences and struggles as lessons on how to overcome adversity. He had learned that real change didn't just come from actions, but from sharing your journey, showing others that it was possible to grow, to change, to move forward from past mistakes. Linda had noticed the difference in him more and more. She had seen him grow from someone who was distant, judgmental, and withdrawn, into someone who was truly engaged with the world around him. They spent more time together now, having real conversations about things that mattered, about the future, about the past, about how they could make the world a better place, even in small ways. The distance between them that had once seemed so insurmountable was now shrinking, and they were slowly rediscovering the bond they had once shared. One evening, as they were sitting in the living room, Linda looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "You know, Dad, I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but with a hint of warmth. "I think you've really done it. You've changed." Mr. Thompson looked at her, surprised but deeply moved. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice soft. "I mean," she continued, "you've done more than just apologize or say the right things. You've actually changed. And that's something not everyone can do. But you did it. I'm proud of you." He felt a lump form in his throat at her words. I couldn't have done it without you, Linda. You showed me the way. And the kids, they've taught me more than I ever imagined." Linda smiled, her eyes glistening just a little. "You're not done, Dad. There's always more to do. But you're on the right path, and that means everything." The conversation was simple, but it held so much weight. For the first time in a long time, Mr. Thompson felt like he was truly seen for who he was now, not for the mistakes of his past. And that was a feeling he had never thought possible. As Mr. Thompson stood on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, he had been a man filled with bitterness, carrying around a heavy load of guilt and shame, too afraid to face his own biases and mistakes. Now, standing in the same neighborhood, everything felt different. He wasn't just part of the neighborhood anymore. He was a true member of it. He had learned to connect with people on a deeper level, not just through shared interests, but through understanding, empathy, and genuine care. The kids from the basketball court were more than just faces he recognized now. He knew their names, their families, their stories. They weren't just the kids from across the street. They were his community. And he had learned to care about their lives as much as he cared about his own. He had seen their struggles, their triumphs, and most importantly, their resilience. In many ways, they had taught him more than he had ever imagined. And as he looked at the court, now empty in the fading light of the day, he thought about the power of second chances. How many people in his life had given him the opportunity to make things right? Linda had. The kids had, and even the community had shown him that change was possible, that forgiveness and growth weren't just ideas, they were actions. He had learned that redemption wasn't something handed to you. It was something you had to work for day after day with every choice you made. Mr. Thompson turned back toward the house, feeling the cool evening air on his face. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future held or how many more challenges he would face. But for the first time in years, he felt at peace with who he was. He wasn't perfect, and he never would be. But he was trying, and that was enough. Inside, Linda was finishing up a phone call. She smiled when she saw him enter, and for the first time in a long time, it was a smile that was free of any hesitation, free of the shadows that had once loomed over their relationship. It was a smile of pride, of connection, of knowing that they were finally moving forward together. "Ready to go for a walk?" she asked, her voice light. "Yeah," he said, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Let's go." And as they walked out the door side by side, Mr. Thompson couldn't help but think that this was what it all boiled down to: a journey. A journey of growth, of forgiveness, of learning to embrace change, no matter how difficult or uncertain it seemed. He didn't know where the road ahead would take him, but he was ready to walk it, one step at a time. Over the next few months, Mr. Thompson continued to settle into his new life. His involvement in the community grew, and so did his relationships with the kids, their families, and even the neighbors who had once kept their distance. He wasn't just known as the quiet man who lived on the corner anymore. He had become a fixture, someone people relied on and respected. And it wasn't because of his past accomplishments or any grand gestures he had made. It was because of the genuine effort he had put in to be a better person, day by day. One of the most significant moments came during a local town meeting where community leaders were discussing ways to improve youth engagement and make the neighborhood a better place for kids. Mr. Thompson had been invited to speak, an invitation he would have never imagined receiving just a year ago. As he stood before the group, a mix of old and new faces, he felt a mix of nerves and gratitude. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what makes a community strong," he began, his voice steady but thoughtful. "It's not just about what we do for ourselves, or even for each other in the immediate moment. It's about showing up, being present, and giving the next generation the tools they need to thrive. I've been lucky to have the chance to do that in my own small way with some of the kids in this neighborhood, and I've learned more from them than I ever expected." He paused for a moment, looking out at the faces in the room. "I've made mistakes, big ones, but what I've learned is that it's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to change, to listen, to take responsibility for your actions, and to show up for the people who need you." There was a quiet, thoughtful pause after he spoke. Then, to his surprise, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't just the words that had impacted them. It was the authenticity behind them, the willingness to admit his past mistakes and show how far he had come. It was real. It was raw. And it was something that resonated deeply with everyone there. Linda, who had been sitting in the back of the room, watched her father with a quiet pride. She knew that it hadn't been easy for him to stand there, sharing the truth of his transformation with so many people. But she also knew that it was this very honesty that had helped him rebuild not just his own life, but the connections that had once seemed so distant and impossible. Later, as the meeting wrapped up and the crowd dispersed, Mr. Thompson found himself surrounded by a few of the kids from the youth center. They were eager to thank him, to shake his hand, to tell him how much his words had meant to them. It was a humbling moment, and one he would never forget. "Mr. Thompson," one of the boys said, his voice full of respect, "you've taught us a lot more than just basketball. You've shown us that it's okay to mess up as long as we learn from it and keep moving forward." Mr. Thompson smiled, a deep sense of fulfillment filling him. "Thanks," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You all taught me that too, and I'm proud of each one of you." As he walked home that evening with Linda by his side, he realized that he had found a new purpose, one that wasn't about being perfect, but about being present. He had become part of a community that was constantly evolving, and in doing so, he had found the kind of peace he had been searching for his entire life. A year passed since Mr. Thompson had started down this path of change, and with each passing day, he became more deeply embedded in the fabric of his neighborhood. He continued to mentor the kids at the youth center, helping them not only with basketball but with life lessons that he had learned the hard way. He spent countless evenings having conversations with kids about their dreams, their fears, their struggles, listening in a way he had never listened before. And with every interaction, he saw himself becoming a better version of the person he had always hoped he could be. One evening, as he was leaving the youth center after a particularly uplifting conversation with a group of teenagers, he was stopped by one of the parents who had been at the community meeting months ago. She was a woman he had never spoken to much before, but she had been one of the first to offer him a genuine thank you after his speech. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice warm and appreciative, "I just wanted to thank you again for everything you've done, not just for the kids, but for all of us. You've really changed things around here." Mr. Thompson smiled, grateful but a little humble. "I've just been doing my part," he said. "There's still a lot of work to do, but I'm happy to be a part of it." The woman shook her head. "It's more than that. You've inspired people. You've shown us that change is possible, and that's more than just doing your part." He felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't just about his actions anymore. It was about the ripple effect he had created. The way his own journey had inspired others to look at themselves and ask, "How can I be better?" It was the kind of change that wasn't visible at first, but now, looking around the neighborhood, he could see it in the way people interacted, in the way they supported one another. As he walked back home that evening, he thought about how much he had learned in such a short time. He had come so far from the man who had once judged others and distanced himself from his community. He had learned that true strength didn't come from isolating yourself or building walls around your heart. It came from reaching out, from admitting when you were wrong, and from taking the difficult steps toward becoming better, not just for yourself, but for the people around you. When he got home, Linda was sitting on the porch, waiting for him. She looked up when he walked in, a smile spreading across her face. "Dad," she said, her voice soft, "I'm really proud of you." Mr. Thompson sat down next to her, the cool evening breeze wrapping around them. "I'm proud of you too, Linda. You were the one who showed me that change was possible. I owe all of this to you." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with affection. "You did the work, Dad. You showed me that you were willing to do whatever it took to become the man you wanted to be. And that's all anyone can ask for." They sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of the day slowly lifting as they both reflected on the journey they had been through together. There was still work to do, still lessons to learn, but for the first time, Mr. Thompson felt at peace with who he had become. He wasn't perfect, he never would be, but he was trying, and that was enough. As the stars began to appear in the sky above, Mr. Thompson realized that he was no longer defined by his mistakes. He had built a new life, one based on growth, on community, and on understanding. And as he sat next to Linda, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for everything that had brought him to this moment. The future was still unknown, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it, with hope, with determination, and with the knowledge that change, no matter how hard, was always possible. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you want more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.